Good evening, comrades. Hey, it's me, Mr. Waldrop. I will be on a field trip tomorrow for the Renaissance Festival, so I am making this video, and I'm going to use a not quiz an ed puzzle to have questions embedded in the video. So that is your assignment for today, and I'm going to make two of them. The first topic I'm going to talk about is the Bolshevik Rebellion. By the way, this is an actual Russian hat. You want to see what one looks like? But the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the Bolshevik Rebellion. So, to begin this story, I need to tell you about a guy named Tsar Nicholas II. Okay, he's also known as Alexandrovich Romanov. And this would be the guy who would be basically the king of Russia. And he would take over in 1894, right? So right around the turn of the 19th century. During this time, Russia is the largest country on the planet, right? It still is today. It's the largest in size. It's not the largest in population, but it is the largest country on Earth in size. It stretches all the way from the Baltics all the way to the Pacific. You're welcome to look it up in your Chromebook and see just how big it was. But like most of Russia's history, this one in particular, the poor are getting really, really poor. And the rich are getting very, very rich. Particularly when it comes to World War I. They're going to get extremely rich off, just the machinations of making war. Somebody's got to build all that stuff. And usually when you're building tanks and whatnot, somebody's getting really rich off that. And you're definitely going to see that happen in Russia. So the workers are very poor, and the rich are getting very rich. It is around this time that he only has one son, and his son starts getting really sick. And this is going to be in 1905. Now remember, World War I is going to break out in 1917. 1914 is when it's going to break out, from 1914 to 1917. Okay, so it's around 1905, before the war, his son starts getting really, really sick. They're not sure what's wrong with him. They bring the best doctors they can find in the country. And this is the heir to the throne, so, you want to take care of him. And they cannot figure out what's wrong with him. And finally, they hear about this shaman, this monk, if you will. And he's supposed to be a Christian faith healer. Now, if you remember back to an earlier lesson when we were talking about the dangers, particularly if you took geography, but the dangers of translating the Bible, right? I mean, obviously there's benefits to translating the Bible, and that's that anybody can read it, and you don't have to take your pastor's word or whatever. There's not going to be as much shenanigans about tricking people into believing stuff. But here's the problem. What if you translate the Bible and people just choose not to read it? It creates a scenario where it makes it really easy for somebody to come along and who has read the Bible. Because you got to realize, particularly back then, not everybody's even literate. Somebody come along and read the Bible and come up with some really hokey stuff. And we still see this today, right? Whether it's, different cults and whatnot. But anyway, this guy named Grigory Rasputin comes along, and he's this faith healer. And he comes along and says, bring me to the prince, and I'm going to heal the prince for you. And they bring him the prince, and he's like, look, I need all the doctors to go away. I got this, right? And the prince gets better. But the problem with Rasputin is he was a terrible person. He was the kind of guy that would sexually harass the staff. He would show up to formal dinners just dressed in regular clothes or slobbish clothes. I mean, he was just a really bad, crude person. He'd say inappropriate things at the dinner table, stuff like that. And so after a while, they're like, okay, well, we've gotten your services. We don't need you anymore. You need to go and get on out of here. And so they kick Rasputin out of the palace, and then the son would get sick again. And finally they'd cave in and say, okay, fine, you get to come back. Just, heal the prince. Okay? And this would go on and on and on. Each time he would get a little more emboldened and realize they really need him. And the royal court, they're just getting fed up with the guy. But anyway, that's going on. And then during the course of this, the war is going to break out. Now, in 1905, the people decide to revolt. Right? They're sick of how rich the rich are getting. This is the same time Rasputin's coming along. And that's also another thing, too. There's kind of this question of, like, how much is the Tsar even trying to run the country, or is he just worried about his own son? And the people demand to have a national assembly. They want some say in their government. And they create this, like, really weak branch of the government. It's got no real power. And this is going to please nobody. The people realize it's a sham, that they still have no say in the government. And Tsar Nicholas doesn't like having his authority questioned. So it doesn't make anybody happy. This is going to go on for a little while longer, for the next 9 years. And eventually Russia's going to go to war, right? They're going to go to war in World War I. They're part of an alliance with England, France, and eventually the United States. Well, if you remember back, Germany is operating off that Schlieffen Plan, where they want to try to hurry up and defeat the major European powers first, like France and England, before Russia can mobilize and attack them from behind. But unfortunately for Germany, Russia mobilizes way faster than they thought. They thought it would be years. Russia mobilizes significantly quicker than that. But there's that old thing like, if you do a rush job, you're going to get kind of a crappy product. And that's kind of what happens with Russia. They mobilize really quickly, but they don't train the troops very well. They don't arm them hardly at all. It's one of those, like, every other guy gets a gun type situation. So if you remember, they were supposed to fight the Ottomans. Remember, Germany got the Ottoman Empire to attack them, to keep them off their flank. And what Russia thought was, well, these Ottomans, they're some crappy little third world country. We'll just wipe them out, be done with them, and go help fight with Germany. Well, it's not going good. They trained them poorly. They didn't equip them properly. And the Ottomans, this crappy little ragtag country, to Germany's perspective, they're holding their own. They're actually kind of beating back Russia. And this is shocking the world, right? This is just unbelievable to see this happening. It'd almost be like a college football team taking down an NFL team. It's that level of kind of shock. Like, wow, I can't believe we're seeing what we're happening. While this is going on, they got to feed the troops, and they didn't take enough time to get ready for war. So the troops are getting the lion's share of the food, which means people back home are starving. You also have to know, too, the Tsar, his wife, was German. So there's a lot of people that are maybe even suspecting that she doesn't really even support the troops. And, of course, they're living, like most rich people in Russia, they're living very luxuriously while people are starting to starve to death. And anytime you have people starving to death, you got the kids starving to death, you start pushing them into doing, like, really desperate things, right? So it's not a good recipe for Russia. Anyway, going back to Rasputin. Rasputin is getting really out of hand. He's sexually harassing the staff. They kick him out. Child gets sick again. They beg Rasputin, please come back and heal the kid, right? Well, finally one day, he kind of sexually assaults the queen. And so they kick him out. They say, look, no matter what happens, he's gone. We're not bringing him back anymore. The kid starts getting really, really sick, right? And, finally, after a couple weeks, he's getting really sick. He calls his mom in, and he starts telling his mom goodbye. He's like, Mom, I'm sorry that this is going on. I love you. I'll see you in the afterlife type thing. And obviously, this freaks out the wife, and she goes to her husband. She's like, look, I don't care what he did to me. I don't care what he's done. You have got to bring him back. You got to save the son. So they do. They bring him back. Rasputin comes back, and sure enough, the kid gets healed again. Now, we kind of suspect that maybe the kid had an allergy to, this is, using a historian's perspective, that maybe the kid had an allergy to aspirin. And so maybe that was going on, that the kid just had an allergy at. And so the doctors would show up and the kid would be running a fever and they would give him aspirin. And then Rasputin would show up and he'd do his little hocus pocus faith healing. And it would allow for the kid to get better because they'd get him off the aspirin. And that's what the belief was, is that, it was an aspirin allergy. So that's going on. And finally, when they finally bring him back, the royal court says, look, obviously, whatever this guy's doing, he's got some kind of power over the queen. We don't know what it is, but, clearly this is just never going to stop. So we're going to have to take matters into our own hands. So they bring the queen, they bring Rasputin. And they say, look, we're going to have a feast in your honor. Thank you for saving the prince. We're going to have this magnificent feast, right? And I'm going to attempt to explain everything that happens, but keep in mind that a lot of this we just don't know. So I'm going to do my best. And a lot of this will just be speculation on my part, but let's try to figure out what happened, right? So Rasputin shows up, and they give him this feast in his honor, and they decide to put poison in the feast. And so he's sitting there, poison in the wine. And so they give him some wine that's poisonous, right? But I think it's like arsenic or something like that, rat poison. Anyway, so he's sitting there, and they give him enough poison to kill an elephant. He's guzzling it down, having some drinks of it, and he's not dying. And then they're freaking out. They're like, what in the world? And so he guzzles some more wine down, and, he's just asking for more. And they give him enough poison to kill an elephant. And he's just fine. And finally they're like, well, God, what are we going to do? Like, we brought him here to kill him because obviously the king doesn't have the mental fortitude to say no to his wife. And the wife is not going to let her son die. So this guy's got to go. They bring him in, and when it won't happen, finally somebody goes up to him and says, like, look, we're just going to shoot him. So they do. They go out and they just shoot him in the chest. Right? Shoot him 3 times. And they go and they're starting to talk amongst themselves like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened, blah, blah, blah. And then they go back in the room where the dead body's supposed to be, and Rasputin's crawling away. He's still alive. So they wrap him in a blanket, and they tie him up, and they throw him in a river. And he gets out. He gets out of the blanket. He should have died of hypothermia right then and there. He crawls the beach, and finally he dies of hypothermia. So I don't know what's going on. It's it's just this freaky story in history. If you're interested in Rasputin, you can look it up. It's a crazy story. But anyway, so he dies. And eventually the son dies too. So there's no heir to the throne. But during this course of time, there becomes this perception, maybe rightfully so, that the king is more preoccupied with his son than he is the war. And the war is not going good at all. So finally, in 1917, there begins a women's march in the capital city of Petrograd. And that's where the capital is. This is before Moscow, obviously. And they're marching for International Women's Day, and they're protesting all the food shortages. So workers and students show up with signs saying, down with the Tsar. The Tsar sends in troops to stop the protest, but rather than stopping it, the troops actually join in on the protest. And the protest eventually becomes a full-scale riot with the people deciding to take over the capital. So he doesn't even have control of the capital anymore. So on March 2nd of 1917, in the middle of the war, the Tsar decides to give up the throne. And Russia will set up a provincial government. So it's kind of like a little makeshift government to tide them over. So they set a provincial government. And it's kind of having to be forced to share power with the Petrograd Soviet Party, who wanted to completely change the government, right? It's not enough to have a small change. They needed a giant change, right? So they're sharing some party power with this little Petrograd Soviet government. And the Provisional Government is continuing to support the Allies at this point. So a small portion of the Soviets call themselves the Bolsheviks. And they're led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin has already been to prison for protesting the government. And he'd already actually lost a brother to protest. They just snatched him up and killed him. So he really hates the government, and he desperately hates the war. So he's very much against the war. And the Bolsheviks' main belief is that they should redistribute all the land and all the wealth to basically the poor that have suffered. And they start running on the slogan of bread, peace, and land, right? Those are three things they're fighting for. And you got to realize the people are starving, so this is very appealing to people that are starving to have somebody come along and say, hey, man, support me and your family gets to eat. The wars continue to go very poorly. Troops are beginning to desert the front lines. Many soldiers that begin to desert the front lines begin to start trying to take to the streets in full-blown mutiny. So the government begins to send in troops to the returning home troops that are now trying to commit mutiny and overthrow the government. They bring in troops to put down those troops, and it just becomes a full-blown chaos, right? It's kind of becoming a civil war. It gets so crazy that Lenin and his best buddy Stalin are going to be forced to flee to Finland, where they're going to continue to run the party from Finland. Then a socialist named Kerensky takes over as the new leader of the Provisional Government. And he cracks down on the Soviet Party, right? And he declares Lenin a German spy and that he should be put to death. So the Bolsheviks decide, we've had enough of the government, we're going to lead a rebellion against the government with many of the soldiers that are sent to stop them. So the government sent in soldiers to stop the rebellion, and they're swapping sides. They're deciding to join the rebellion instead. They amass so many troops that Lenin comes back, and he personally leads the troops to take over the government and eventually takes over the capital. So he'd take over the country, and he would place himself in charge. He'd kill the Tsar Nicholas, and his family too, which, if you ever watch the story Anastasia, this is the story of the fall of the Tsar. So his whole family gets killed, including Anastasia, so she dies in real life. Lenin places himself in charge of Russia, and the rise of the Soviet Union takes over. And you got to realize, at the time, like now we look back, particularly us with our American sentiment, and y'all probably haven't even learned about Lenin, but if you talk to the average American, they hate Lenin, right? He was the bad guy. He was the villain of the story, so to speak. But the people of Russia at the time loved him. I mean, they went from fighting a war that was not going well. They were starving to death. It was really, really bad. And this Lenin guy comes in, and you got to understand what Russia was to them, right? That was, their home. They're very proud of their country, and this guy came in, and he's just restoring pride. And he changes the name from Russia to the Soviet Union. And we're going to have the Soviet Union really up until my lifetime. And we'll talk more about that later, the fall of the Soviet Union. But yeah, the Russian people loved him. They're going to give him this huge, glorious funeral when he finally dies. And for a long time, he was this Russian folklore hero guy who saved Russia from the terrible leaders that were running. So, but yeah, that's it. And this is the first two videos. And the second one is going to be a follow-up one on the Red Scare. So finish this one first, then move on to the Red Scare.